More than 2 billion people in the world call themselves Christians. Many pray, go to church, and trust that the stories told about a man named Jesus 2,000 years ago accurately describe the life of their Lord and Savior.
But did Jesus ever really exist? Or was he just a brilliant fictional creation of a group of men looking to start a new religion? That's what we set out to uncover in this episode of
Is That For Real?
Perfect.
So, there's a little background information for you, but did Jesus really exist? Or is he just a mythological feature, maybe even a composite of a bunch of other people? What do you think, Deasis? Do you believe Jesus was real?
That's a tough one, John. It really is. And, we know that this is a very heavy subject for a lot of our viewers here. This is something that is very important to many, especially here in America. And even it was, that was even the case for us at one time. I was at once a Christian, and I believed in Jesus very much. I remember even thinking about the sacrifices that he made and the things that he did for us, allegedly, and it would bring me to tears. So this is definitely spoken with all due respect to our viewers out there who do believe in Jesus. But as far as Jesus being for real, I would say I am torn. I think, and this is, like I said, this is my personal thoughts on it. I'm not trying to sway anyone. We're not trying to sway anyone either way.
We're just here to present the facts, that's all.
But yeah, like I was saying off camera, I'm very torn about the existence of Jesus. At this point, I would say that I personally believe that he could have been a man who existed, if at all, but I think that he might have been just a Jewish rabbi in the area of Galilee, and that he wasn't supernatural in any way, shape, form, or fashion at all, but that he was a man of Judaism with a little bit of Eastern philosophy mixed in with it, and that was it. As far as the divinity, the miracles, anything divine that they claim he did in the Bible, I am honestly not convinced of it.
Well, this is what I'll say before we get started. Like you, I was raised in an ultra-conservative Christian religion, no longer identify as a Christian, but I have mad respect for like the moral lessons and the teachings of the gospel, and if Jesus was a real person, for the person that he must have been to be able to come up with all those things. As far as the facts and the evidence for his existence goes, I believe that Jesus was a real human being. I believe that he existed, but I will say that the evidence against it is very compelling. But there are some caveats to that. There are some caveats to that we'll go through in the last section about whether or not Jesus was mythological. But this is kind of a new argument. Yeah. Very few people questioned the existence of Jesus up until around 200 years ago. And that's when you started to see, with the birth of the scientific method and things like that, people began to question whether or not Jesus was a real human being. It's interesting, though, and we'll get into this in some detail as we go along in the show, that very few other historical figures are put under the same kind of scrutiny that Jesus is put in terms of his existence. And my problem with that right up front is, we've talked about this often on the show, is confirmation bias. Like, you're looking for what you want to prove because you want to prove it, and you ignore the other side. And I'm afraid that you see in this subject matter, just like all the others we've covered, you see a lot of that on both sides. Right. The people who are hell-bent on proving that he was real, the people who are hell-bent on proving that he wasn't. Very few people willing to just say, the evidence is pretty strong this way or the other way, but we can never know for sure, because how could you ever really know for sure?
Yeah, and I think that I think that the reason that this one has definitely been so scrutinized in the last 200 years, and even lately with the rise of the internet, is people are laying down their lives for their belief in Jesus. So this is a very important question for consideration as to whether Jesus was real, or at the very, or more importantly, was he of divine nature? Because people have sacrificed their lives over the centuries for this person. And so you have one argument where people are defending their faith in him, and then you have the other argument where people are trying to negate him because they say, well, shouldn't we know that the person that we're sacrificing our lives for was even real in the first place? Is our faith unfounded? And as for the people that are watching that believe in the Bible, we are supposed to test our faith. We're supposed to be like the Bereans. We're supposed to examine these things and test our faith.
Right. And that is a fair point, that people aren't as interested in other historical figures' existence or not, because their existence or not has virtually zero impact on our day-to-day life. Whereas if Jesus wasn't real and you're a Christian, that matters.
Right.
That matters a lot.
Yeah.
But before we get into the evidence, first let's run through a segment about what people believe when it comes to whether or not Jesus exists, and then we'll talk about it.
More than 9 out of 10 American adults, 92%, say Jesus Christ was a real person who actually lived. The percentages dip slightly among younger generations, with only 87% of millennials believing Jesus actually lived, 91% of Gen Xers, and 95% of baby boomers.
Most adults, not quite 6 in 10, believe Jesus was God, 56%, while about 1/4 say he was only a religious or spiritual leader like Muhammad or the Buddha, 26%. The remaining 1 in 6 say they aren't sure whether Jesus was divine or not, 18%.
I gotta be honest with you, John. I am shocked. Me personally, I'm shocked that these numbers are not way lower.
Really?
Me personally, yeah. Because most people that I talk to, this is just the area, maybe this is the people that I talk to. So fair enough. I don't have any kind of data or anything to back this up, but most people that I talk to, they believe Jesus was probably just a man. Mm-hmm. I'm not at all surprised that millennials believe it less.
Yeah, I'm surprised that it's not lower for millennials than it is. 87% is still really high.
People talk about millennials in a really bad way a lot of the time. But there is one thing I will say for millennials, and you're Gen X, and I'm tail end of Gen X. I used to be millennial, but now they've moved us up. So now Gen X, I think, goes all the way up to 85. So I'm either Gen X or Xennial at this point. But I will say this about millennials, and here's one thing that I do like about them, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're living in the age of information, as it would, the later age of information, where internet, Google, it's everywhere. It's on your phone. It's at the library. It's at McDonald's. I mean, it's just everywhere.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They are less inclined to believe in stuff like this anymore. They're less inclined to believe in Christianity. They're a lot more inclined to be skeptical and just think that it's all BS.
Yeah. Now, we're not going to tackle any of the theological concerns around Jesus a little bit on the end, because we have to when we talk about whether or not he's mythological in nature. Right. But for the most part, what we're trying to tackle is, was he a real human being? I mean, whether or not he was later made into something else isn't really the point of this particular video. But I do have to say, though I personally was not surprised that so many people, so many Americans believe he was real, I was surprised so few Americans believe that Jesus is God, because the vast majority, I mean, I only know of like 2 out of hundreds of denominations that do not teach that Jesus was God. So with so many Christians in the U.S., it's surprising that only 56% of people believe that he was God, and only about 1/4 of people just believe he was like a big spiritual leader, and that's it. That was surprising to me.
Well, a lot of people profess to be Christian,
That's true.
But are they really Christian? Are they really? I mean, how many times do you go to church or talk to Christians, and most of them just passively say, I'm Christian, a lot in the same way that many people would passively say, oh, well, I'm Buddhist or I'm Muslim, mainly probably because their parents are in it.
Right.
But
right.
it's rare, especially nowadays, from what I've seen, where you actually see diehard devoted Christians who really believe this stuff fundamentally.
Now that made your experience of not getting people on make much more sense. Tell us about what you tried to do and how that turned out.
Right. I'm a little disappointed, but not surprised, that there were no Christians that were willing to come on the show to defend their position, especially from an archaeological or historical perspective. Because I posed the question out there on Is That For Real on Facebook, on my personal page, and have just been asking a lot of my Christian friends, even one who's very devout, I'm not going to say his name, but he is a hardcore Christian. And I invited him to come on the show and defend his faith and the reason for his belief in Jesus' deity from a historical or archaeological standpoint. No one contacted me. No one responded. Not one person. Not one. Nobody was willing to come on the show and explain from a historical, archaeological, in any way that would make the belief in Jesus a valid belief. No one was willing to do that. And I think that says a lot. As a matter of fact, to me, in my opinion, that says everything.
Yeah, that does speak volumes, I think.
Because
I was a little surprised because you get routinely lambasted by people who are all about Jesus, but then they wouldn't come on the show to talk about it.
They jump on my page, they condemn a lot of what I say, and the things that I say towards Christianity, Christians, the Bible. But when it actually came time, it's like, okay, well, stand your ground. Yeah. Be like the Christians, or was it Jesus, who said, give an explanation for those who are demanding, give a reply to those who are demanding explanation for the faith that is in you. And not one person was willing to do that. And granted, I mean, I haven't reached the whole world, but everybody in my group, in my area that I hit up, nobody.
When it came time to put up or shut up, they all just shut up.
No. They did. And because, in my personal opinion, it's because they know that there is no way from an archaeological or historical point of view that they can even come close to defending their faith. It's very easy for someone to sit here and say that they believe in Jesus and that he was real. A lot of Christians, Jesus was real. We got historical proof right here. Okay, is there any kind of proof of his validity, of miracles or anything divine? Do you have any kind of evidence, good evidence or proof for that? They all get quiet. And then I ask them the same thing I ask everybody. Okay, so then what's the difference between believing in Hercules than Jesus? I mean, they were both demigods. They were both half man, half God, supposedly. What's the difference between putting faith in either one of those? Neither one of them can be historically or archaeologically validated.
Well, now that's what we'll get into now. Can Jesus be historically or archaeologically validated? There's a lot of information on both sides, so we're going to cover both. And that's really the primary thing here. Can we prove through historical means that Jesus was real? And whenever people talk about this, there's two major figures that always get debated. Tacitus, who's the first one we'll talk about, and then Josephus. So first, let's roll the segment on who Tacitus was and what he said, and then we'll talk about how what he said or wrote gets debated. Publius Cornelius Tacitus, born in 55 CE, was a Roman senator, orator, and ethnographer, and arguably the best of Roman historians. Tacitus' last major work, titled Annals, includes a biography of Nero. In 64 CE, during a fire in Rome, Nero was suspected of secretly ordering the burning of a part of town where he wanted to carry out a building project, so he tried to shift the blame to Christians. This was the occasion for Tacitus to mention Christians, whom he despised. The quote from Annals reads as follows:
"Neither human effort nor the emperor's generosity, nor the placating of the gods ended the scandalous belief that the fire had been ordered by Nero. Therefore, to put down the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished in the most unusual ways those hated for their shameful acts, whom the crowd called Christians. The founder of this name, Christ, Christus in Latin, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Suppressed for a time, the deadly superstition erupted again not only in Judea, the origin of this evil, but also in the city Rome, where all things horrible and shameful from everywhere come together and become popular.
Now, Tacitus and everyone else we're going to talk about, one of the first things I want to point out is he was born after Jesus, the normally accepted date for Jesus' death. And that's true of everyone we're going to reference here. And that's one of the big cons, or what the skeptics say, who say Jesus wasn't real, is like the very little bit that we actually have is coming from people that lived after he died. And so there's like no one who was alive when Jesus was alive to say, oh yeah, I knew Jesus, we hung out at the pub or whatever.
Right.
They didn't have anything like that to show that he was real. And that's one of the big things that we'll see as we go through the information.
One thing that I see is that a lot of Christians are unaware of the history and archaeology surrounding Jesus. And that, like we were talking about off camera, everything that was written about him was written after his death. There was no contemporary writings of Jesus. And you would think that somebody who is raising the dead, somebody who is doing all these miracles, that was his great teacher, you would think people would be talking about him nonstop, regardless of the fact if this is Satan's world or this, that, and the other. You would think to help reinforce his followers' faith, Jesus would have made sure that people were just yapping it up about him.
Yeah. Even the accepted earliest gospel, Mark, the vast majority of scholars believe was written 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. So we're talking about decades in between Jesus' death and the first things that we have that were written about him.
Yeah.
So there's that. But now as far as Tacitus goes, the pro side is that what Tacitus is supposedly wrote is in his Latin style. It's a very terse style of the period, and that was very in use by him, very common for him. And it sounds like Tacitus. And that's important when you're looking at old writings, that it sounds like the author's other stuff. Because if it sounds way out of place, then you know, yeah, someone stuck that in there, right? And the second pro thing is that earlier in his career, Tacitus was the proconsul of Asia. And so he spent a lot of time in trials of Christians, because Christians were persecuted during that time. And so he would have known a lot about what Christians believed. And keep in mind, Tacitus was no fan of Christianity. He hated Christians. And he was one of the people who was there to prosecute them for the Roman government. So yeah, he was a proconsul, which kind of like, not exactly, but sort of like Pontius Pilate, the one who condemned Jesus to death according to the Gospels. And he makes mention of that, of Pontius Pilate, and that they were called Christians. They call him Christus or Christ, and all of these things in his writings. So the people who say, look, see, Tacitus shows us that Jesus was real when he gives these detailed specifics about Jesus. Now, on the against side, we have what we've already said, that Tacitus, at best, is secondhand information because he wasn't alive at the time. Yeah, it wouldn't be fair.
Nobody wrote about him while he was alive.
Yeah. But the second one really stood out to me because I didn't know this. Again, we're raised conservative Christian, religion. So what do you hear? You hear that Nero blamed the burning of Rome on Christians.
We were taught that growing up.
Yes,
that's what we were taught.
They get that from Tacitus. But he is the only one out of all the historians and all the historic writings of Rome that ever mentions the burning of Rome being blamed on the Christians by Nero. And Tacitus only mentions it once, something that important. And he really hates Christians, right? But he only brings it up once. And that's highly suspicious and makes
Right.
the people who don't believe Jesus really existed think that was added to his writings
because it looks
later.
like an insertion.
Yes, it looks like an
You
insertion.
don't have like a whole segment of writings where he's devoted to talking about that, which would have been incredibly monumental. Nope. Just one little, slip in.
If Tacitus knew that Nero blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome, then everybody else would know it too.
Yeah.
So why is Tacitus the only one who mentions it?
Yeah. And why is it written so long after the fact?
Yes. It's very interesting stuff there. All right, now the last one, and this one also was huge, I saw on the skeptic side, was no Christian apologists of the time, the ancient Christian apologists, in case you're not familiar who that is, because Christians were not liked generally until Rome finally made Constantine made Christianity the state religion, they were not well liked because they're very different. And so they would have these apologists, these converts to Christianity, would try to defend it from its critics. But none of the apologists, none of them, ever quote what Tacitus wrote to prove that what the stories about Jesus were true. None of them. Why wouldn't they quote the most famous historian of Rome?
Exactly.
Proving that Jesus was executed by Pontius Pilate and all these other details about Jesus being the Christ and all that, if they had it at their disposal, but they never use it. And I got to say, that's a pretty strong condemnation there. What do you think?
I think that, again, we are not trying to bash anyone or anything. It's just this is a serious topic to talk about and to be frank and objective with because people are sacrificing their lives for this supposed savior. But it is really hard to represent this argument fairly and to be on two sides of it because, in my opinion, it's so one-sided. I mean, the evidence against Jesus' existence, in my opinion, is just way stronger than the evidence for his existence.
It's interesting to me that
Just
in this
me.
case, we're on opposite sides because I don't think the evidence is stronger that he didn't exist. I think the evidence is about the same. I think the strongest evidence for the existence of Jesus comes later when we start getting to people who claim that Jesus was mythological in nature. And I do want to say this in case the Christians feel like they're being assaulted here. You can count on one hand that's missing some fingers, how many actual scholars and historians think Jesus was not real. The vast majority, 99.99.5% say yes, we have just as much or far more evidence about Jesus' existence than we do about other major figures in history. So historians routinely, you will. In fact, I tried to find a book written by a well-known historian or Christian antiquities scholar who knows the time period really well that would say Jesus wasn't a real person. Nobody. There's nobody who is well-known and credentialed who's saying that. Most of the people who say Jesus doesn't exist are not experts. And I think
even Bart Ehrman admits that he existed. Right?
Yeah. Bart Ehrman has a whole book written on the fact that he existed in the evidence.
He doesn't even deny. Yeah.
He doesn't. But again, to be fair, argument from authority is a logical fallacy. We've said it before. We said it on our last video. Well, before this one, we might be dropping something else later. Just because all the authorities say something's true doesn't necessarily mean it's so. They might have reasons for claiming it's true. And the first one that jumps into my head is people like Bart Ehrman. Hello, he makes his entire living off of the history of Jesus. If Jesus wasn't real, guess whose pocketbook's going to get hit? And so the people who are deniers would point that out and say, follow the money. All these Christian antiquities historians, they're scholars who make a living off of Jesus and Christianity. And if it falls apart, so does their paycheck. So I get it. I get that just because they all agree that he was real doesn't necessarily mean he was real. But I am not so jaded.
Especially doesn't mean he was divine.
Yeah, well, I'm not so jaded to historians and the facts that we do have to think that they're really that I'm not a conspiracist for history. Let me just put it that way.
Right.
Though I am a fan of Graham Hancock. Fingerprints of the Gods, people. Look it up.
I still got to read that.
Yeah, we got to look up that. Now, the next guy who's the big name, Tacitus is first, and then comes Josephus. And we know who he was.
Go.
We heard from him a lot. So let's roll a segment about Josephus, who he was, and what he wrote, and then we'll talk about it.
Titus Flavius Josephus, born in 37 CE, was a first-century Romano-Jewish historian who was born in Jerusalem to a father of priestly descent and a mother who claimed royal ancestry. Josephus recorded Jewish history with special emphasis on the 1st century CE and the First Jewish-Roman War from 66 to 70 CE. In his two great works, The Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities, both written in Greek for educated people, Josephus tried to appeal to aristocrats in the Roman world, presenting Judaism as a religion to be admired for its moral and philosophical depth. The Jewish War doesn't mention Jesus, but Jewish Antiquities does mention Jesus, twice. The shorter of these two references to Jesus is incidental to identifying Jesus' brother, James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. In a temporary absence of a Roman governor between Festus' death and Governor Albinus' arrival in 62 CE, the high priest Ananus instigated James' execution. Josephus describes it as follows.
Being therefore this kind of person, i.e. a heartless Sadducee, Ananus, thinking that he had a favorable opportunity because Festus had died and Albinus was still on his way, called a meeting, literally Sanhedrin, of judges, and brought into it the brother of Jesus who is called Messiah, James by name, and some others. He made the accusation that they had transgressed the law, and he handed them over to be stoned. In the second reference to Jesus, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, Josephus states, Around this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who did surprising deeds, and a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who in the first place came to love him did not give up their affection for him, for on the third day he appeared to them restored to life. The prophets of God had prophesied this and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, have still to this day not died out.
While I'm convinced that one of these mentions of Jesus by Josephus is legit, there is one that is suspected of forgery, to be fair. Even though Josephus does mention Jesus allegedly, it's still secondhand information.
Yeah.
It's still. I am a skeptic here. I'm not going to lie. I'm a respectful skeptic, but that is secondhand information.
Yeah, Josephus was born a few years after Jesus is thought to have died, and he wrote about him twice in Jewish Antiquities. One of them is thought to be a forgery. Even scholars believe that quite a bit of it is forged. But not very many scholars believe the entire passage is forged. They just think a lot of stuff was put in there. Like Josephus, like Tacitus, no fan of Christianity at all. He was a Jew, saw Christianity as heretical,
right,
and would not be speaking well of Jesus, so he wouldn't call him the Messiah,
right,
like it shows in that passage. He wouldn't have said that. And also, despite that, he doesn't cite his sources. Like you said, we don't know where Josephus got this information.
You gotta wonder, why would such a great and amazing person have so many enemies? Virtually everybody hates Christians or hated the Christians except for the Christians.
Yeah, well, I know what Christians would say about that.
Right, yeah, they're being persecuted.
Well, yeah, the whole world is against them because they have
I'll tell you the truth.
and of man's salvation, and it's all the work of the devil or whatever.
Right, and I understand that. Okay, but I'm just thinking about it from my own perspective here. If, regardless of whatever I believe, and I'm definitely not a Christian anymore, but if I know somebody who claims to be divine, who is raising people from the dead, doing all of these great and loving things and talking about salvation, resurrecting my family, bringing us to heaven or wherever, whatever you believe, whether you inherit the earth or you inherit heaven afterward, you would think that everybody would love this guy. I would love this guy. I'd be like, wow, you know what? I was actually this, and this. But you know what? This Jesus guy, I need to jump on board with this because this is a great guy.
Well, I got to push back on that one a little because I think of like MLK. Message of love, message of hope, message of unity.
That's a good point.
And yet...
But he could not raise you from the dead.
Well, that's true. We couldn't do that. But
We're talking about bringing people back here, guys.
Anybody who threatens the power structure, and the word... I know some people who say Jesus wasn't political. That is some BS. Because when you read what he said in the context of the history in which he said it, it was extremely political.
That's true.
In nature. Very political.
Yeah, and for people, for our viewers who may or may not know this, the things that Jesus said, if he was in fact saying those at the time of his existence, could have gotten him killed.
Yeah, very much so.
The Roman Empire was nothing to mess with back then, and he was talking about a new government. He was even talking about being king and savior and all that.
If he was the Messiah, the Jews believed he was going to become king and conquer Rome.
Yeah,
and that made him a dangerous character of insurrection at the time. Now, to use this on the pro side, though, Tacitus and Josephus hated Jesus. Even though they lived after Jesus had already died, it's not like they lived 100 years after he died. It was a couple of decades, especially Josephus, because he was born just a couple of years after Jesus died. It would have only been like 20 years later, right? If Jesus didn't exist, they would have argued that he didn't exist, or they wouldn't mention him at all. But they do. They do mention him. And although the Tacitus one, let's say that even if that one could be dismissed as a forgery, at least one of the quotes from Josephus, nobody dismisses as a forgery. No scholar dismisses as a forgery. And why wouldn't Josephus, of all people, say that Jesus either wasn't real to argue against him or just not mention him at all?
He didn't mention anything divine, he did.
Well, no, that's true, but we're not talking about divinity here. We're talking about whether or not the man existed, not whether or not he was God or divine or any of those things.
I will say he could have
different
existed.
Argument.
Okay, to be fair, yes, Jesus probably did exist. Can't argue that one. I like to be truthful anyways. Like I said, I'm not trying to swing this anyway. Jesus probably did exist. I'm still kind of skeptical of that, but to be fair, it's very likely he existed.
There is some more evidence on both sides, and we'll keep going through it. Now, first, again, on the pro side, even though few scholars believe that the testimonium, the longer passage, is completely authentic, they say that because the shorter passage, the way it's worded, is referring to something from the prior passage, like it references back to it, then that means the whole thing must not be a forgery. Some of it, sure, absolutely. Like some of the insertions about him, the Messiah or whatever. Yeah, that's definitely a forgery. But part of it was there. So both references are at least partially from Josephus, and therefore you can't just dismiss them as being complete forgery. That's what I was able to uncover on it. But there is some against also. The against, again, no loyal Pharisee or Jew is going to say that Jesus was the Messiah, but the scholars don't doubt that that was part of the forgery. That Josephus could report that Jesus had been restored to life on the third day and not be convinced by this astonishing bit of information is beyond belief. Again, though, that's part of what scholars admit was probably forged. Now, this part is stronger. Right after the passage, Josephus goes on to say, about the same time, also another sad calamity put the Jews into disorder, end quote. Now, Josephus had previously been talking about the awful things that Pilate had done to the Jews in general, and one can easily understand why a forger would have chosen that spot to put the text in about Jesus, because he's talking about Pilate doing all this bad stuff and then puts that in about Jesus. But afterwards, he fails to change the wording of the bordering text. And so he leaves what is called a literary seam that sticks out in the words of this author, like a pimpled nose. Like when it sounds like Josephus started writing, talking about Pilate, and then something was put in there. And then if you go to what happens afterwards, these two connect, but this one looks contrived.
Right.
Like it was
Somebody
inserted.
just slapped it on there.
Right. Now, I couldn't find any scholars that agreed with that. But that when you read it, I get why.
Right.
It does look that way. It really does. So I understand the argument there.
There's an aspect, too, that I want to talk about. I want to talk about Matthew chapter 24 for a minute.
Okay.
Okay, so as John mentioned a little while ago, Matthew and the Gospels were likely written after the fact. Now, if you are a supporter of Jesus, it could have been written, because scholars don't know exactly when it was written. Could have been written beforehand, could have been written after. As a skeptic, I believe this stuff was written after the fact. But in Matthew chapter 24, because this is one of the things that cements Jesus as a prophet, they talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, a lot of people will go further with that and say, oh, well, he was talking about the last days of our time too. I disagree with that because he talks about this generation. And he says, this generation will not pass away. He didn't say the generation of the last days in the distant future. He said this generation, referring to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. But scholars think that that was written after the fact. It was written after 70 CE when Jerusalem was actually destroyed. I believe that. So if that is true, and scholars think it is true, then that would negate what he said in Matthew chapter 24 being prophetic. So that was just another tidbit that I was thinking about.
Yeah, that is true. And we were talking about this the other day, and this is where it gets really fuzzy. Yeah. You got to understand that when you're dealing with ancient history, it's not like you can pinpoint that he wrote it on Saturday, February the 2nd, the year 42 CE. Right. You can't know that.
12:59 p.m.
Nobody wrote dates on this stuff, and so it's very difficult to pinpoint. So what they do is they read how it's written. They compare it to other writings of the day. They look at things like what was it supposed to be prophesying to happen, and they use that to kind of date it. Now, here's where I got to give the Christians some leeway. If a scholar is a skeptic already, the scholar's going to say, well, he prophesied the fall of Jerusalem, but I don't believe in prophecy, so that means he wrote it after that year, right. So we're going to put it after that year. But a Christian would say, but I do believe in prophecy, so I believe it was written earlier, and I think you have to kind of dismiss that as part of the line of evidence, but it is part of the line of evidence that they use, and you need to stick with other ways of dating it, like the writing style. But even then we have a problem, because I've been told that I write, the way I write sounds like it's much older, like I'm much older than I am. And so if someone were to read my writing style, and it's probably because I read a whole lot of books from like the 30s and 40s when I was coming up. I used to love to read old novels and stuff. And so maybe that's why I write that way. But if, let's say I died in my writing, because of course I'm going to go down as famous and it's going to get...
Me too!
It's going to get buried in a jar somewhere and someone's going to dig it up. And let's say
it's going to be a gold statue of you. It's like, wow, who is this God that we should worship here?
Right. So now let's say they read my writing. And they say, oh, well, this guy sounds like these other writings that we dug up that we've dated around the 1940s. They might think that my writings are from the same period. Now, they're not that far off in the scheme of thousands of years, 60, 70, 80 years, and that's pretty close. But when you're talking about prophecy, that's 50, 60, 70 years, that means everything, because you're dealing with whether or not someone believes that the prophecy came true. So those years matter. And you run into that problem that your worldview, and we talk about this all the time on the channel, your worldview will dictate how you read the evidence of how to date when those books were written. And that's just a fact you can't get around.
I mean, it is interesting. We could die, and hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, people could say that we never knew each other.
Yeah.
Because of the writing style. Let's say I wrote a bunch of stuff too. They'd be like, oh, well, Deasis and John lived about 100 years, after or before each other, or 60 or 70 or 80 years. And, we would laugh about it now because it's like, what are you talking about? We know each other. We're contemporaries.
Right.
But people who are looking at this hundreds of years later might say, okay, well, Deasis seems like he comes from a later time period. John must have been evidently from the 40s and lived between that time. So, getting back to the argument for Jesus, and I hate to agree with John on this, but he does have a good point, and so do scholars. It's not a very good gauge, and there's a very large window there. I mean, what do they say with the Gospel of Matthew? Between, 40 and 70 or 80 CE?
No. Mark is the youngest.
Yeah.
And they put that between 66 and 70, with a few scholars saying it may have been written a few years earlier, but the majority
Matthew
saying
had
it's
an even
after.
larger window.
Matthew's later. Matthew's like between 80 and 120.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's a very large window.
That's a big window. Yeah.
So
it's tough. It's tough. And I get why a Christian would say, well, of course they're going to say it was written later. They don't believe in Jesus' prophetic nature.
Yeah.
So I understand that.
Yeah.
I do get that.
And the truth is, if we are being completely middle of the road here, which is what we try to do here on this show, middle of the road would say, well, to be perfectly honest, and on both sides, we can't prove that the Gospels, some of the writings were written before or after Jesus.
You can't prove
making them
anything.
prophetic or not prophetic.
Yeah, you can't prove anything absolutely when it comes to that. We're dealing with documents that are copies that are hundreds of years younger.
I'm a skeptic, but I will say that.
Yeah.
We cannot positively verify it was definitely written after, this period.
And we don't,
some of them.
we don't have any of the autographs, and they call them, the autograph is the original writing. We don't have any of those. All of them are hundreds of years younger than what the original must have been. And even if we did have the original autograph, radiocarbon dating, even if you could carbon date it, because it was paper, papyrus, it was plant-based, it could be radiocarbon dated. Radiocarbon dating is not exact either.
No.
You have big windows. And so you could get it, within 100 years or whatever.
Yep.
But that's about as close as you're going to get. And when you're dealing with prophecy, man, that much time matters a lot. Because we're dealing with whether or not Jesus prophesied the fall of Jerusalem in 70,
right,
or it was written after the fact.
Which is a very important question, because for Christians, their faith literally hangs on that.
Yes.
Because if it was written after the fact, that means that it is not valid, it is not prophetic. It was just made to look prophetic so that you would believe. But if it is written before the fact, then it is prophetic, and you do have a very strong argument for belief.
Yes. Even if you're a preterist, and those are the ones who believe that everything in the Bible was fulfilled with the fall of Jerusalem,
yeah,
and that the book of Revelation deals with Rome and the Roman Empire, not anything apocalyptic later. Even if you believe that, you still believe in Jesus, you just think all those prophecies were fulfilled in the past.
Yeah.
It still matters. It doesn't matter whether you're one of the fundamentalists who believe we live in the end times now, or whether you're one of the preterists who believe all that was fulfilled in the past and we're just here to continue Jesus' work of, sharing the truth about him as the Savior. It doesn't matter. That number, the date of those documents matters tremendously. And that's why this gets argued
very important
so much. Yeah. Yeah. And there were a couple of other people. We don't need to go into detail about them because Tacitus and Josephus were the two big whammies that everyone looks at. They were very, very well-known, respected historians.
Right.
And so they matter more. But there were others, like Lucian of Samosata was another one. There was Celsus, a Platonist philosopher who considered Jesus to be a magician who had exorbitant claims. But again, he didn't argue whether or not he was real. And that's something you'll find. No one who does mentions Jesus, as few as the mentions are, no one who mentions Jesus ever argues against his existence. None of Jesus' enemies argue that he wasn't real. They just argue that he wasn't who he said he was, and that his followers were wrong. So that
would be where I'm at. Yeah. Even if Jesus existed, I'm not convinced personally that he was who his followers claimed he was.
Then there was Pliny the Younger, also well known, a Roman governor and a friend of Tacitus, and he wrote about early Christian worship of Christ as to a god. So he kind of shows in his writings, again, no fan of Christianity, but he shows that they view Jesus as a divine being. Now, it doesn't prove Jesus was divine, but it does show that these people are talking about him as if he really existed.
That actually brings up what we were talking about earlier and something that I kind of want to mention about Hercules. So, and this is, I feel like I've read this somewhere, but I'm kind of going off on a trail here. But wouldn't it make sense to make Jesus demigod, half man, half God? I mean, the Greeks would not have taken Jesus seriously as a deity if he was not at least half man and half God. So, it's very interesting that Jesus was half man, half God, because that was popular in what Greek and Roman mythology to have demigods, because they wouldn't even take him seriously if he wasn't half man, half God. And Hercules came before him anyways.
Yeah.
So,
it is
kind of makes you wonder.
It is interesting that
maybe they borrowed from that.
The earliest gospel, Mark, does not talk about a virgin birth. It's the next one. Matthew, which is next in line, talks about the virgin birth. Luke talks about the virgin birth. But Mark does not. And so it's interesting if you read the Gospels that...
It's like, oh man, this ain't working.
The message didn't start to go out to the nations until after it was largely rejected by Israel, right? By the Jews themselves. And it's not until the later Gospel that suddenly Jesus has a virgin birth, which lines up with what you're talking about, that the Romans and the Greeks wouldn't have taken him seriously if he wasn't at least a demigod. So, and... Bart Ehrman, I believe, is one who talks about that. Yeah, in one of his books.
I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense because they wouldn't take him seriously. They had to adapt their approach, and it seems like Judaism, when you read about Judaism and Christian, Judaism or whatever, Judeo-Christian stuff, it seems like it evolved with the times like anything else. They found things that worked better, and they went with that.
Yeah, it seems like kind of a huge thing for Mark to leave out of the gospel that Jesus was born of a virgin.
Exactly.
When the others mention it, that's kind of a huge deal.
That's a huge thing.
But again, this is speculation. So this is all about worldview. The Christians, there's all kinds of apologetics for this too. Yeah. And because nobody can know for sure, though the skeptic would say, of course we do. Of course we know for sure because none of this stuff really happens.
Right.
Where the believer would say, you don't know it doesn't happen, you just don't believe in it. It's an argument nobody can really win completely.
And this is another problem that bothers me with Christianity. And this is one of the biggest things. In light of all this, and in lieu of everything that we've considered, Christians will still say, well, you just gotta believe. Oh, you don't see it because God has blinded the minds of the unbelievers. And that's a terrible thing to me. I think it's a terrible thing, and I'm just going to call it like I feel. I'm going to say it respectfully, but that bothers me a lot because I'm a sincere truth seeker. And if I could find, facts on Jesus being divine and my Savior, I would gladly devote my life to him, worship, praise, and worship him.
Yeah.
So
you just don't think the facts are there.
Right. Yeah. So for God to blind my mind because I'm being objective, even respectfully objective, and trying to cement my faith with actual archaeological and historical evidence, or even asking in faith for him to appear to me, and I have not seen him yet, is very, I feel like it's a very mean thing to say to somebody.
That makes you a true skeptic.
Yeah.
Because a true skeptic believes once they have enough evidence to believe. You're not out to disprove it because you don't want to believe it. You just don't believe the evidence is there, and that's why you don't believe it.
I'm looking for the evidence, and studying about the origins of Jesus in the Bible is actually what made me not a believer of it.
Right.
I used to believe in it until I did start to study its historical and archaeological evidence, and then I didn't believe it anymore. So I hate it when they say, "Oh, well, you just got to believe, and you better believe, or you're going to die."
Right. And from our discussions off camera, you would like to believe.
I would love to believe.
You would love to believe. You just don't think it's there. So no, that's a very good point.
I am a sincere truth seeker, and I would love to believe that everything that Jesus and God said about the afterlife and paradise and heaven is real. Who wouldn't want to, believe that?
Sure.
Not only for them, but for their family. And the only thing you would have to do is make a few small sacrifices in showing of thanks to have these things. Of course I would do it. Of course I would. Who wouldn't? So when they say, "Oh, well, you're not seeing it because you don't want to see it because God has blinded you and you're condemned because it's a sin to not, to even not believe is sinful," to me is just wrong and a bad argument, because that is the crutch that they fall on anytime you try to get objective data to actually cement a valid belief in Jesus. They say, "Well, you just got to believe. Well, you just need to pray to him. Oh, well, then you must not be seeing it."
Yeah, that's kind of my problem.
And they haven't really shown anything.
My problem is you have to start with belief first.
Right.
And then use confirmation bias to make all the facts fit what you want to believe. Whereas I feel like, because I'm skeptical by nature, you should start with the facts first and draw the correct conclusion from the facts.
In my opinion, it's like telling you, "John, I've got a house for you." "Oh, cool. Well, can I see it?" "No, you need to believe that I have a house for you first. And if you don't believe, you're going to be punished for your lack of faith that I have a house sitting out here for you."
Yeah, you have to hand over the money first before you see the house.
I'm telling you the house is real.
I got you.
Right. And this is why I have a problem with it.
That's a fair point. I think that's a fair point. I respect that, because being a skeptic, I respect that's more of a proper skeptical attitude.
Yeah.
But these weren't the only guys. Tacitus and Josephus, Pliny the Younger, some of these other guys. There's a bunch of writers that are non-Christian writers that also come into this argument. And on the pro side, like I said, I'll name him. Robert Van Voorst wrote on the pro side. He said, "No pagans and Jews who oppose Christianity deny Jesus' historicity or even questioned it. And non-denial of Jesus' existence is particularly notable in rabbinic writings of those first several centuries." And again, it goes back to the quote, "If anyone in the ancient world had a reason to dislike the Christian faith, it was the rabbis. To argue successfully that Jesus never existed but was a creation of early Christians would have been the most effective polemic against Christianity. Yet all Jewish sources treated Jesus as a fully historical person. The rabbis used the real events of Jesus' life against him because they say that he was violating the Jewish laws, and that made him a rogue that should not be followed."
But this still is written after the fact, though, right?
Yes.
This isn't contemporary.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but we'll get to the contemporary thing in a little bit.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So now his birth, ministry, death, occasion claims that his birth was illegitimate and that he performed miracles by evil magic, encouraged apostasy, and was justly executed. They say all these things, the rabbis do, but they don't deny that he was real. And that is a strong piece of evidence that he actually existed, because they could have denied it.
Sure, I'll give it that.
Because 20 years is not that long. Not that long. And it would be easy for someone to know 20 years later. Now, you could say 120 years later, okay, now we're dealing with some, how do you know someone from 120 years ago really existed before the time that we had all this archived
King
information?
Arthur, Robin Hood shit now.
Right. Now we're getting into where it's much easier to make a myth out of the man. But 20 years later, 30 years later, that's a lot harder.
Yeah.
And the rabbis would have known, or could have easily known, if he didn't actually exist. And that's the argument for why he must have. Divinity aside, that's one of the arguments for why he must have existed. However, there's a strong against, too. John E. Rimsberg, in his classic book, The Christ of Critical Review and Analysis of the Evidence of His Existence, lists 39 contemporary authors, apart from Josephus and Tacitus, that never mention Jesus or the apostles or the disciples in anything that they wrote. As it is, Josephus has only those two small disputed citations, and Tacitus only has the one, which is also disputed. If Jesus really existed and did the great things he claimed, wouldn't the contemporary writers of the day at least mention him or his followers somewhere? I mean, imagine
That's where
this.
I'm at. That's
Imagine
exactly
a
where I'm at.
guy who can heal the sick and raise the dead, walking around doing this, and nobody writes about him? Like, man, I saw this amazing dude raise this schmuck from the dead. He walked out of the tomb.
I'd be like, I hated him until I saw him resurrect this guy. Wow, I'm a believer now.
So that's why I get the arguments against like some of the miraculous stuff about Jesus. But on the flip side of that, if Jesus was just a very caring teacher or rabbi of the day, he was very poor. He wasn't from a well-known household. Now, nobody's going to write about that guy. They would write about a miracle worker, but nobody's going to write about the poor, impoverished rabbi with his poor followers that were just fishermen, which is the lowest rungs of society. I mean, they had they were broke, poor people.
Yeah.
So it makes more sense to me that he's only mentioned by a few people as his notoriety began to grow,
Poor
like
people's religion.
Tacitus and Josephus, very much so.
Yeah.
But not mentioned by a lot of the other writers who weren't interested in some poor rabbi from, Jerusalem, not Jerusalem, but from Israel.
Yeah.
So it makes more sense if on the Jesus wasn't really a miracle worker side than it makes from the Jesus didn't exist at all side. So
Fair.
there you go.
Fair.
However, there's an argument against the argument for that argument.
There's an argument for the argument for the argument for the argument.
And this is a strong argument in favor of Jesus' existence. This, to me, is one of the strongest arguments. For example, few people in the ancient world were as prominent, influential, significant, and famous as General Hannibal. He came close to crushing the Roman Republic, was one of the greatest generals of all time, and was famed throughout the ancient world for centuries after his death, down to today. Yet, how many contemporary mentions of Hannibal do we have? Zero. Zero contemporary mentions of Hannibal.
That's because he didn't do any miracles, man. We don't have a reason to dispute him.
Well, the point is that if someone as famous and significant as Hannibal has no surviving contemporary references,
okay. I get what you're saying.
Yeah, then why would anyone have written about Jesus, the poor rabbi from Israel, right? They didn't mention that. Now, here's the thing.
I don't know, John.
It's not that that nobody wrote about him. It's not necessarily true that nobody wrote about Jesus. We're talking about documents that are thousands of years old, and the odds of finding them intact to begin with are so small when we're dealing with that ancient of a person that until Jesus became followed by enough people and well-known enough, which happened decades, maybe a century or more later, for people to really start to write about him a lot, until he grew that kind of fame, the number of writings about him were too small for any of them to happen to survive to today. But later, when thousands of people start writing about Jesus, now we've got the odds are good enough that these documents begin to survive just through a happenstance down through history. And so we have some of the ones that were written 100, 200, 300, 500 years later, but we don't have anything that would have been written very early on. And that's a strong argument because Hannibal, no better known general than Hannibal, we have zero contemporary writings of him either.
Fair enough, but why in the world would he give us if Jesus is real, why would he give us so little information to go on to cement our faith in him?
That's one of the arguments.
Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the assured expectation of things hoped for, the evident. Now, I don't know if that's just in the Bible that we read.
No, it reads basically the same, yeah.
The evident demonstration, Hebrews 1, the evident demonstration of things hoped for, though not beheld.
Yeah.
Evident demonstration. We've got very little evident demonstration.
Yeah, I don't argue.
And yet we're supposed to die for this and put our faith on the line for this.
Yeah.
I can't do it.
I hear
can't
you.
do it. I just can't.
definitely believe that there's enough evidence that Jesus the man walked the earth and existed as a teacher and a rabbi. I'm with you on the skeptical side of all of the very miraculous things that he said to do, but I also understand
I'm definitely a skeptic.
I also try to be fair.
I'm the skeptic in this episode, damn it.
From the Christian perspective, the Christian would say that the wisdom of Jesus being head and shoulders above the wisdom of his day, and there's good arguments for that. I understand the perspective that that's enough to prove to the believer that the other things are true. Now, it's not enough for a skeptic who wants more facts and evidence, but I lean Cartesian, cogito ergo sum.
Yeah.
So I don't really think anything's absolutely provable anyway, so you may as well believe what makes you a happy, better person. So it's easier for me to be okay with that, even though I'm
being
skeptical.
Above what they were being taught in his day. Even I respectfully disagree with that. I think I think the people who wrote about Jesus, who allegedly wrote what he allegedly said way after the fact, I think it was good knowledge, sure. Was it above wisdom of the day? No, I think it was just as good. I think it was, I'll give it that. I think some of it could have been equal. I mean, as much as I am a critic of the Bible nowadays, which anybody who knows me pretty well knows I'm not a fan of the Bible, there is some good information in Proverbs. I think that there is some good wisdom in there. So,
I hear you. Worldview, man. Worldview. It comes down to worldview again. All right, the last thing we're going to go over, was Jesus just a mythological character put together from other ancient mythologies and invented at the time?
Zeitgeist.
Zeitgeist made that famous, and we're going to do an episode just on Zeitgeist, where we go through all the things that they list off in the movie.
Because I know the Christians are out here saying, yeah, you Zeitgeist bastards. No, we're going to go over that too. So just wait.
The basic argument is that there are parallels between the Jesus stories and pagan myths like Horus, Attis, and Dionysius. The virgin birth being one of them, like we already talked about. A certain number of followers, 12 followers dying on a tree. All of these show in the eyes of the
Set
people
killed
who...
Ra, the sun god, so the sun sets.
Yes, all of those
stuff
things,
like
right. All of that
the 12
stuff.
disciples, the 12 zodiac signs, the 12 months, and then the sun being Jesus, the sun, and they all rotate around him. So it is really clever. It's
what
clever
they say.
shit, man.
That's what they say.
Somebody did their homework. I'll just say that.
Now, but when you start researching it, because I remember when I first saw Zeitgeist, I thought, man,
was blown away.
That's really interesting. But see, then I started to dig into the claims.
Yeah.
And it sounds good
that.
in generalities. It sounds really good. But when you start digging into the actual specifics of the claims, many of these parallels are highly strained. They're really a stretch. And like they'll borrow one thing, like the miraculous conception, from some other mythology and ignore all of the stuff that does not match Jesus at all.
Yeah.
And then they'll borrow one thing, like someone dying on a tree, and ignore all the other stuff that doesn't match Jesus at all. And they'll claim, look, if you take this piece plus that piece plus this piece plus that piece from like 12 other people, he must be a mythology.
Yeah.
And it's really a stretch. I mean, I get it, and it's a cool thing to think about, but it's really a stretch. It feels very strained. And scholars say, yeah, it's very strained. And you don't see any like legit scholars arguing for that either.
Yeah,
but then follow the money. Who's paying their checks? If they study early Christianity, so I get why the conspiracy or mythology people are not so inclined to trust the scholars either. Worldview. However, this is particularly hard to believe. This is a great quote against the mythological parallels. It's particularly hard to believe that this would be true because of the masses of evidence that the first followers of Jesus were devout Jews. a group for whom the idea of adopting anything pagan would be utterly horrific. These were people who cut their hair short, sorry, Diasis, because long hair was associated with pagan
It's a
Hellenistic
shame on a
culture.
man.
Yes, or who shunned gymnasia and the theaters because of their association with pagan culture. All the evidence actually shows that the earliest Jesus sect went through a tumultuous period in its first years trying to accommodate non-Jews into their devoutly Jewish group. To claim that these people would merely adopt myths about Horus and Attis and Dionysius and then amalgamate them into a story about a pagan Jewish hybrid Messiah who didn't really exist, and then turn around and forget he didn't exist and claim that he did really exist and that he did so just a few decades earlier, it's a nonsense hypothesis, end quote.
Okay.
It's a real stretch.
Maybe, but the virgin birth looks a hell of a lot like Hercules, the whole half god, half man thing. So maybe they did, maybe they didn't.
The virgin birth bit wouldn't be nearly as big of a deal to me if Mark had mentioned it too.
Yeah.
But because the earliest gospel doesn't mention the virgin birth, that makes me wonder, was that added later?
It's like, oh man, this ain't working. We better change it up.
Yeah. We
Damn.
got to attract the Greeks
Virgin
and the
birth.
Romans
Remember
in.
that.
Yeah.
Virgin birth.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in all the literature we used to read growing up as kids, they always did make Jesus look really buff, though.
They did.
Like he always ripped muscles and stuff. So.
I mean, yeah.
Could have been Hercules, I guess.
It was her. He was Israel's version, the Jews' version of Hercules, man.
Now, Samson, that's a hell of a story.
Man.
Dude carried iron gates all the way up a mountain, running up a mountain. That's a dude you don't want to mess with.
Got so damn mad he yanked the gates off the town.
Yes.
I'm telling you, they need to get Jason Momoa.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Get
I would
Jason
totally
Momoa,
watch
man.
Jason Momoa as Samson.
So y'all can't come in here. Rips the damn doors off, runs up the top of the mountain.
Absolutely. He would make an awesome Samson.
He
for
would,
sure,
man.
yeah.
I'm so damn jealous of him. I've got like his face and like some of his hair and like none of his body.
Yeah. Now, my next point is about the scholars, but we've already gone through it so much. There's very, very few scholars of the antiquities of Christianity, or even, now this is a stronger point though, there's also scholars who are atheists, agnostics, and Jews. And they also say, no, none of the evidence shows Jesus wasn't real. Of course he was real. Everything we know shows he was real. And one of them being Bart Ehrman, because Bart Ehrman's an agnostic. He's not a Christian. Yet he's got a book, Did Jesus Exist? And he argues for his existence.
Yeah.
But follow the money. Follow the money. I always come back to that one for there. So there it is. Now, another argument is that Jesus was a pretty poor work of fiction if he was really a work of fiction. This is an argument that he really existed. And this is very interesting. Think about it. That the center and climax of the story of Jesus would be based on his shameful execution and death makes no sense if it evolved out of Jewish expectations about the Messiah, since they contain nothing about such an idea. They thought that the Messiah was going to take over Israel, become king, and conquer Rome and free them from Roman oppression. Jesus did none of those things. Nope. So if someone was going to invent a fictional Messiah, Jesus is not the one they would have invented. They would have written a much better dude.
Well, they had to be realistic, John.
Yeah.
They couldn't just tell people to revolt, because then their little sect would just...
True, but it would have
be
needed
like
to match up to
minutes.
Expectations of the Messiah. And Jesus did not.
That's why they did it from heaven.
That's
why he said your reward will be in heaven, because he knew they couldn't do anything about it on earth. Maybe that's what that was about. I don't know.
It's an interesting point.
Maybe.
It's a valid point you make, that because they couldn't create a story about a king who removed Roman oppression because, well, that didn't happen. They had to invent an alternative storyline to make the fiction work. But
they had to make
a shameful execution that would make the Jews really look down on the guy. I think they could have done better than that.
Maybe.
I think they could have done better than that.
I mean, they had to martyrize him, so they could follow him.
All right, so that is all of our evidence for and against whether or not Jesus existed. There's a lot more, but even the skeptics and the pro-Jesus people, they agree on a lot of things. So we tried to approach only the stuff where there's a lot of disagreement on both sides of it. I want to thank again our new patron, Julie V. And I want to thank everyone who's been listening on iTunes and remind you, we're on iTunes. You see the link below. Definitely listen on iTunes. And if you like what you hear, leave us a positive review on iTunes because that helps us a lot. If you don't like what you hear, shut the hell up.
And
I don't want to hear.
Jason
I don't want to hear.
If you're watching, I just hope you know I will kick your ass, man. Yeah. Try to mess with me. I don't care about your big guns, man. I'll be like, boom.
And we will record that
battle. Watch
battle.
the show and subscribe.
And we will record that battle in Diaz's epic fail for all of you to see should the fight with Jason Momoa ever take place.
Well, I mean, he's a big guy. I mean, hell, I'd have to hit him twice. I mean, he's a pretty big dude.
Oh, twice. Yeah, just twice. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. If you have anything you want to add, please leave a comment below. Don't forget to like the video. Definitely write in to the email address above if you have a story you want to share, because we're always interested in anything that's controversial, where there's a lot of argumentation on both sides. And if you have something to say, we will put you on the show if you got any kind of background or credentials at all. So, or just a long history of personal research. Let us know. We want to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification icon so you'll be notified when we release new videos. And as always, thanks for watching.